This podcast is brought to you by WRFL, Radio Free Lexington. Find us online at wrfl.fm. Catch us on your FM radio while you're in Central Kentucky at 88.1 FM all the way to the left. Thank you for listening, and please be sure to subscribe.
Hi, welcome to From the Woods, Kentucky. I'm Laura Lhotka, and I'm here with my co-host, Renee Williams. And today in studio, we have Dr. John Cox. And Dr. Cox is an assistant professor of wildlife and conservation biology in the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources at the University of Kentucky. So it's a pleasure to have you in studio today. And today, with it being April 22nd, which is Earth Day, we're going to do a show on Earth Day today. And he's been on our show before talking about different things, his research on deer and other things. So instead of going through what he does and his background, we're just going to get right into it and go right into Earth Day.
So could you tell us what Earth Day is and how it all began?
Okay, so Earth Day began on April 22nd, 1970, as what we call a sit-in, or basically that's kind of a broader and inclusive, interactive kind of public forum that was created and became kind of popular during the era of the Vietnam War. And so what that means is that thousands of people get together, they attend and discuss environmental problems that what they were facing, among many other issues of the day. And they discuss those from both a human health standpoint, but also from the loss of species and habitats, which were commonly seen from a number of environmental disasters during that era. Today, here we are almost 50 years later, and we celebrate Earth Day with all kinds of educational and experiential events. And these are really designed to inform and involve and also to take action to assist environmental causes that lead to what I would consider a broader natural resource sustainability. So even 50 years later, that cause is still perhaps more than ever moving forwards, and that includes here on UK's campus. And many schools around the nation and the world, so elementary schools, other colleges and universities participate in Earth Day events. But, the interesting thing is how we got to this place of celebrating and working for global sustainability, which has really a deep history, and especially in the context of our, I would say, highly nature-abusive past. So it seems like a really odd kind of sociological about-face.
So what do you mean by this sociological about-face?
Well, the timeline of natural history stewardship is largely filled with examples and thus really has been an ongoing exercise in various failures to recognize and control our impulses to endlessly pursue and acquire goods and services from nature. So thousands of years of short-sightedness and procrastination and just human hubris have led villages, towns, cities, and really entire civilizations to wastefully and neglectfully squander or spoil their own resource base. And that in turn has ultimately led to their own decline or even complete demise, including some of the larger empires. So for much of human history, people could escape their degraded lands and waterways, and they can essentially adopt what a lot of animal species do, and that is to disperse or to migrate away to greener pastures, to more intact forests and cleaner water. The difference there is that animals don't overexploit typically what they use, and they often return to those same feeding grounds following a few months or a few years as the system recovers. But history is replete with stories about places like, let's say, Easter Island in the Pacific Ocean, the Middle East, continental Europe, and other areas where we basically had major resource panics, knowing that we were running out of resources. So, for example, it only took a few centuries after the settlement of Easter Island by the Polynesians to deforest the trees on that island. And those trees were the source of much of their infrastructure and their canoes. And when they lost those trees, that led to prolonged warfare and rapid population decline. And so when the Europeans finally discovered Easter Island, they were like, well, what happened to all these people here? Mm-hmm. In the Middle East, really, that whole area is ecologically very fragile. And we're talking about places like Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Iraq, and other countries that have for centuries been stripped of their trees and vegetation and has largely been converted to unproductive desert in most of those areas. And so they have to engage in very expensive irrigation schemes. And that highly degraded region causes a lot of fierce competition between countries, between tribes, for the scarce resources, which today leads to a lot of warfare, leads to a lot of social unrest. That was really the heart of the Syrian civil war back in 2011 and the immigration crisis that ensued and rippled through the politics of two continents, including what you saw in Europe. And even centuries later during the Middle Ages, when we're talking about the continental Europe, so the mainland of Europe, there were vast forests that were cut down for centuries. And that includes the ones that built the magnificent Notre Dame Cathedral that partially burned down a few days ago. And so as they cut down these forests, the streams were polluted by runoff from farms and logging. And then you had freshwater fish die as a result of all that pollution. You had iconic animal species like the auroch, which was the early wild ancestor of cattle. That species went extinct. And other animals like wolves, brown bears, beaver, and a lot of your other fur-bearer animals were hunted or trapped to extinction in your most accessible areas. So they kind of went out and were dispersed into the hinterlands, and they really didn't play much of a role there in Europe for a number of years. So what essentially happened in Europe was the royalty started to panic because there were few trees left, there were few animals to hunt for meat, and things like that. And so that was one of the primary motivators for setting off for new lands during the age of exploration in the Americas, in the Far East, and in Africa. That motivation wasn't to find new resources and use them in some sustainable manner. It was really just an attempt to continue the exploitative nature for various empires and colonial powers. There was a feeling during this time, but ensuing centuries, of what we might call cornucopianism, or the notion that there's endless resources or somewhere out there waiting to be discovered and tapped, and that people have an inherent tendency to think that, well, there's always going to be more timber, there's always more clean water, more game animals for fur and meat. And in fact, even during the colonial period of America, there was really no concept that an animal could go extinct. There always seemed like there was plenty of them out there to hunt or to trap for furs and for meat. So people always assumed that these big beasts, mysterious beasts, were always somewhere off, just waiting to be rediscovered by explorers. And Thomas Jefferson and other very, inquisitive people like paleontologists were extremely interested in the fossils of long extinct animals, such as the ones that came out of Big Bone Lick, Kentucky, up in the northern part of the state. But they really didn't know what they were. And so Jefferson thought that these mysterious creatures must be out in the unexplored West, and he encouraged Lewis and Clark on their 1803 expedition to bring one or the parts of these so-called incognitum, or elephant-like beasts, back to the East for study. But it turns out these happened to be mastodons that had disappeared thousands of years ago. And then after that, other Ice Age creatures turned up in the fossil beds, and pretty soon it was determined that they were no longer to be found, that they were indeed extinct, and people began to realize that animals and plants really could be lost forever. So the next few centuries saw more and more extinctions of single species like the passenger pigeon, Carolina parakeet, the great auk, the dodo, and the decimation of a lot of our native populations of many other what we might think of as iconic species like wolves, mountain lions, bison, black bear, and elk, all across the U.S. So more and more people started to notice this, and they started lamenting the loss of not only these creatures, but also the native peoples and the cultures that were disappearing along the way as we moved farther west. As human populations grew, more and more people became aware of the loss of this land, the loss of creatures, and sort of a pioneer way of life. And two technologies really brought this home during the 18th century. And they had major impacts for both increasing the awareness of the beauty of the land, but also the abuse of the land. And the first was the rapid development and expansion of what we might think of print material, so newspapers and magazines. And that led to a widespread dissemination, but also increasing appreciation of nature as art. And that was something that was uniquely American, unspoiled by centuries of abuse, which was found in Europe. And so there was a historian called Roderick Nash who called this the Great American Identity Crisis, in which the intellectual classes of America, and to a lesser degree persecuted religious organizations, started to adopt unspoiled nature as something uniquely American and as a place of sanctuary to escape the ills and sins of society. So these were indeed places to begin anew, sometimes in spirit for a few days by putting one's life in perspective, or as sites to establish a new religious order. And the second major technology that really influenced nature conservation was the invention of photography. So Matthew Brady, as many people might recognize that name, he really showed the world the human tragedy of the Civil War through many of his photographs. And now that technology became useful for documenting both the beauty and the destruction of nature. So these two developments really sobered people up to the reality of our environmental impacts, and they increased national and global awareness that would eventually spur political and social movements to kick off. And that's what is now known as the era of early conservation, where leaders such as John Muir, Gifford Pinchot, Aldo Leopold, and particularly President Theodore Roosevelt would help establish government and legal foundations for conservation. So these were important times because they established a strong federal precedent in creating a broad national network of protected areas like parks and wilderness areas, and they provided wildlife protection and restoration that most of us now take for granted and we enjoy. So I would say these leaders were truly exemplars of responsibility, and they really persuaded the public to start taking better care of those resources. So now we have laws that have codified the importance of national parks and wilderness areas, waterways, clean air, and actually even the sanctity and the responsibility for us to rescue species that are in trouble. And that's done under the Endangered Species Act. So the advancement of science has further bolstered our ability to describe, understand, and make predictions about the world in ways to develop solutions to our current environmental crises. Although many would argue that we place too high a risk in terms of betting that our technology will rescue us from our own self-made ecological calamities.
Well, what about today's technology and media-savvy human populations? What challenges do they pose to environmental conservation?
So today our media and methods to learn about and communicate about the beauty of nature has somewhat changed, but it really still relies on the audiovisual appeal, our sense of aesthetic beauty, awe, and sometimes feeling of responsibility to protect natural resources. I mean, the internet has exponentially really increased our awareness of information, and that could lead to action for a more sustainable planet. In many cases it has. But at the same time, the same media format has kind of supersaturated us with an endless choice of audio-visual stimuli that can really overwhelm our senses. And I think in many cases there's so much information out there that it desensitizes us to the many dire environmental situations that we've been made aware of. And that can also lead to a sense of hopelessness and despair among people that watch those kinds of programs frequently. So millennials have already been well documented to have higher rates of anxiety and depression because, unlike past generations, I think they're more aware of the magnitude and scope of the many environmental problems and challenges that we face. So I guess the great irony is that the more digitally connected we are, the more we seem to be losing our ability to effectively engage and skillfully interact with people in person. And so those who are aware of the magnitude of a planet with so many social and environmental problems, they often seek refuge in the world of social media and video games and mind-numbing hours of TV and binge watching movies and so forth. And that can be a problematic feedback loop whereby we not only lose valuable time and social building skill, but we also lose our sense of purpose and responsibility that gives our lives meaning. What's interesting is that the behavioral sciences are increasingly finding that our world of gadgets and digital distraction that are created by the I would say, the well thought out and seductive social media algorithms of Silicon Valley, the so-called attention engineers, or as I'd like to call them, the attention pirates, are harming us in a multitude of ways. And so what's clear is that we really need time and space away from devices that are supposed to serve us, but instead strive to instantly gratify us through changes really in our dopamine levels in the brain, and so at a very fundamental level of our neurochemistry. And so consequently, and ironically perhaps, most of us end up serving these devices under what has been called the tyranny of the immediate. So there's a growing sense that if we want to maintain our mental health and reduce stress and have some peace for ourselves and family, we need to reduce or eliminate or put the brakes on this kind of digital addiction. And one important way of doing that could be a simple re-immersion into the quiet and intricate world of nature. I mean, there are certainly nature retreats and digital detox places and activities that are designed to temporarily put one into a digital rehab and kind of get you clear-minded again. But I think perhaps a better long-term solution is to engage in a more prolonged relationship with land and community through what might be called a land ethic or stewardship model. So environmental protection and stewardship, those things mean different things to different people. And so for some, it's about personal health and well-being, access to clear water and food and air and green space like parks and public lands. And for others, it's about owning or leasing or participating in the care or rehab or improvement of lands, and not necessarily expecting any material benefit. So the conservationist Aldo Leopold said that the oldest task in human history is to live on a piece of land without spoiling it. So to me, a steward is someone who cares about and takes care of the land and the community, both human and biological. And it depends on and develops what I would say, a deep-rooted sense of place and commitment. So they want to take care of the future by assisting with land, water, and air, rather than, let's say, forsaking these resources for some bigger, better future that's based on endless, unsustainable consumption that seldom quenches a deeper spiritual thirst. So I happen to be a lucky farm owner with many areas of degraded land from past poor land practices, and it's a work in progress. It's a labor of love, and I personally derive a lot of pleasure from what is very much a process of creation and artistry in shaping a piece of land. And while one can be pretty lucky enough to own and help conserve one's own private land, I think as much can also be done on public lands, such as in parks and refuges, and national forests. And if they're local, then you can kind of consider them your own in a way. And that small, quarter-acre patch of woods and the nearby creek in a suburb neighborhood, those all can be a world of exploration and really a form of a basis of, let's say, childhood wanderlust that stimulates further interest in action later in life by young people. So I think the sum of many small actions of natural resource stewardship can add up to substantial benefits at larger scales. The simple participation in such activities can lead to pretty positive mental health benefits when spending time in nature. And some people have referred to nature now as the HMO, the health HMO, okay, given the measurable impacts it has on lowering stress and releasing feel-good chemicals in the brain and within our bodies as we exercise and think about nature and immerse ourselves in nature. And I think also from the good feelings that we get from both fellow participants in the notion of ecological redemption, in that we are healers and caretakers to sustain our needs and those of other life forms, including that of the future. So in a world of increasing human population growth and resource scarcity, and the looming threat of global warming, it really only makes sense for our continuation as a species in being good stewards and neighbors that we shepherd this wonderfully diverse and beautiful planet towards a more sustainable future through thoughtful, careful actions.
That's great. That's some great information. I know a lot of our listeners, probably really resonate with the message that you have. And I know you teach a couple courses, so if they're interested in what you've been talking about, these are some of the items that you talk about in your classes. Can you describe the two courses that you teach where you cover kind of some of these topics?
Yeah, so in the Forestry 101 class, which is the Introduction to Wildlife Conservation, we do talk about the history of conservation. And we talk about different species and things that you can do to be good stewards of the land. And also in Forestry 435, which is an upper-level course in conservation biology.
You've presented us with a lot of great information. So what would be one or two takeaway items that you would like to leave our listeners with?
Given the Earth Day potential here to get out there and do things, I would definitely encourage your listeners to participate in events on Earth Day. And some of those are found here on campus at UK or found throughout the Lexington area. Go out there, take a family member or friend and create an ecological legacy. So make lasting memories, do the good work of restoring and maintaining, and in some cases creating works that will hopefully far outlast our brief lives. So I think really in the end, your grandchildren and theirs, they're going to thank you for it.
Well, thank you, Dr. Cox, for joining us today. And if you would like more information on what you've heard on this segment of today's show, visit our website at www.fromthewoodsky.org.
Stay tuned now for another episode of Extension Notes.
Welcome to Wildlife Sounds from the Forest. This is Dr. Matt Springer. I'm an Assistant Extension Professor of Wildlife Management within the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources here at University of Kentucky. I'm here to teach you a little bit about the animals that live in our forests, especially those here in Kentucky. For those of you who might just be joining us, each week we'll play a wildlife sound from our forest. Here's our sound for this week. Stay tuned. Towards the end of the show, we'll talk about this animal and why it is making that sound.
Thank you for tuning in to another version of Extension Notes. Today we are going to be speaking to Dr. Ellen Crocker. She is an assistant professor in the Forest Health Research and Education Center in our department, and she's going to be speaking to us about invasive plants. So tell us a little bit about what we're going to see this spring and what's the problems with all that.
Great. So invasive plants are plants that are not from here. They're not native to this area, but they are causing big problems. So these could be problems for the environment. This could be problems economically. So they're not from here, and they're kind of wreaking havoc. And invasive plants are frequently the first thing to get their leaves in the spring and the last to lose them in the fall. So this time of year, I know a lot of different things are starting to flower and leaf out. Probably the first things that you saw leafing out and flowering might have been some invasive plants that we have in this area. So not only does that give them an edge over native plants, they're able to photosynthesize longer.
They have a longer growing season than the good stuff.
I know it. Isn't that a shame?
Yeah.
So it makes it easy to spot them this time of year because, other things might not be as green. Mm-hmm. So the first thing I noticed leafing out this year was bush honeysuckle. So are you all familiar?
Yes, that's always a major one.
Oh, yeah. It is a huge problem here in central Kentucky, but it's also spreading out to a lot of other areas. So as the name implies, it's a bush, but it can actually grow quite tall. And if you see some of these older bush honeysuckles that have been around for a while, they're almost small tree-like. Yeah. And if you're in central Kentucky, it's everywhere. Look for it along roadsides, in the understory of any park or wooded area. It is super dense and all over. It was initially introduced as a landscape plant for hedges or erosion control, but then it's gotten out of control. It is native to Asia. And some of the kind of characteristics about it, probably most of you are way too familiar with it, so you don't need any help identifying it. But it's got opposite leaves, and if you break one of those stems open, it's hollow on the inside. It's got those really distinctive honeysuckle flowers with red berries, and it's really dense. And that prevents native species from being able to grow underneath it. If you've walked around where this plant is, you know that it takes over everything, and you won't find those wild wildflowers that you might want to see this time of year. Underneath it, you won't see tree seedlings coming up because it's all honeysuckle. Yeah, so it sounds like you all have seen this well.
Yes, we have. So how do we get rid of this honeysuckle?
Well, people love it in their yards. I mean, some people hate it. But some people like it because it is this really dense bush that kind of maybe shades you from your neighbors, protects you from some road noise, but there are some good native alternatives to it. And to get rid of it, I'll talk a little bit about that later, but I think now's a good time to see it and to identify it. Now's not the best time to manage it. Bush honeysuckle is one of those things that if you were just to cut it, it would, sprout back up and there'd be even more of it than there was before.
So it makes it mad.
So you've either got to get that whole root out of there, or you've got to apply some kind of herbicide to really kill it. So those are a couple things. Another invasive plant that you might confuse it with is we have another invasive honeysuckle that's a vine, Japanese honeysuckle, and it has a lot of the same features, but it's a vine, so it's really going to more carpet areas growing all over everything, and it's got those flowers that you might remember from your childhood that really smell super, super fragrant. So like the honeysuckle that you think of, that's the smell of its flowers. It's a nuisance throughout Kentucky. So another honeysuckle. We do have some native honeysuckles, but if you're seeing honeysuckle, that's probably not what you're seeing. You're probably seeing an invasive one. So after seeing the bush honeysuckle all leaf out this spring, the second thing I saw were white blooms, white flowers out in the old field areas and roadsides that belong to a different invasive plant, the Calorie pear. Have you all seen these as well?
Yes, they're everywhere.
All over, yes.
Yeah. So that's just kind of, I think, not as, it was a lot of flowering maybe last week and the week before, but a little bit less now. It's a plant that was initially promoted as an ornamental landscape tree because it does have those really pretty flowers. They do look nice. I can't argue with that, especially in the late winter when we really need something pretty. But even though it was promoted as a nice street tree, it turns out that it's actually a terrible street tree because it falls apart. It drops branches, it splits in half. It really doesn't tolerate kind of snow and ice very well at all. So it's a bad tree for that reason alone, but on top of that, when it was initially promoted, people said it was sterile, so the seeds wouldn't spread, but it turns out that's not entirely true, as you know from looking around you. So it has just spread into a lot of different areas and is another major problem.
And is it also known as the Bradford pear, or is that a separate tree?
Yeah.
Okay.
So the Bradford pear is a particular cultivar of kind of the general Calorie pear. Okay. And so one of the things about it is that Bradford pears just within themselves are sterile, but there's a lot of other cultivars. And so all of those seeds, if they were two different ones together, they could be viable. We also have, native pears. There are pears for fruit trees that people are using. So there's a lot of different pears that are out there. A lot of the ornamental ones in that group are called Calorie pears. So Bradford's a type of that. Definitely. People use those two words.
That's the one I was more familiar with.
I have a aristocrat pear in my backyard, I found out.
Another cultivar. So, and yours looks pretty and is a big, pretty tree, but I know it's giving you some problems
Root
now.
problems, yes.
So even though they look pretty, they can be problematic trees. And I think the Lexington no longer recommends them at all for street trees. I don't think they're even allowed as street trees anymore. So just a heads up, don't plant them. If you're thinking about what tree you want, there's some great alternatives. Don't plant a Bradford pear. You can do better than that. Another invasive plant. And so those two, bush honeysuckle and Calorie or Bradford pear, really familiar. You've probably seen them all over. But I want to tell you about one that I've seen popping up for the first time this year in this area, and that's called lesser Celandine or fig buttercup. So if you've seen this plant, you've probably seen it and thought, wow, what a beautiful flower. It's got these dark, glossy, heart-shaped leaves, and then these really attractive, shiny yellow flowers. It's in the buttercup family, so if you've seen buttercup flowers, you kind of know what I'm talking about. This past spring, it's kind of one of the kind of first things that would flower, a spring ephemeral, just not a native one. So this is another invasive problem. I saw that somebody in the Chevy Chase neighborhood planted their whole front yard with it. And then I have also found it popping up in some of the public areas nearby. It's really more of a problem. It's moving into this region, and it just takes over. It will totally carpet an area. And the interesting thing about it is that it's a spring ephemeral, so it comes and goes. And then the ground that's left behind is just bare for the rest of the year. So not only is that not attractive for you in kind of a yard setting, but it also means that that's going to be potential erosion problems. It means that all of those other spring ephemerals that you might want in your woodland aren't going to have that space. So it's another big problem. And one of the issues with that is that underground, it has all of these tiny little tubers that make it really hard to dig up. And even if you do dig it up, you've got to get every one of them, and they kind of dislodge in the soil really easily. And then if it really likes to grow in stream sides. And so just imagine it's growing in a stream. Those little tubers could be carried further downstream really easily. So another thing to look out for. And that's one that look around for it. You might see it, and definitely next year I have a feeling we're going to have a ton of it, and it's better to catch that early and stop it before it takes over your entire yard.
Okay.
Yeah. So one other one I'll mention is that soon we'll be seeing the white flowers of the invasive garlic mustard. It's in the mustard family, so it has these small cross-shaped flowers that are characteristic of that group. It's native to Europe, Asia, parts of Africa. And the first year, you may not notice it. This plant has 2 years that it takes to grow. And the first year is just a little clump on the ground, just a little rosette, leaves, nothing too noticeable. But that second year, it shoots up this tall stem and a flower, and it produces tons of seeds. And even though it comes and goes, so it only lives for 2 years, and it's got to reestablish with those seeds, it can really just take over in kind of a trailside, roadside area, underneath your trees in a woodland. It can really just form a really dense carpet that, again, will prevent our native species from being able to live there, and for us to be able to enjoy them. So I told you some doom and gloom invasive plants that you might expect to see. I think this is a really good time of year to see what you have and go out and scout, because a lot of them do flower, do leaf out so early. And now's a good time to develop a management strategy. So what you're going to do if you want to get these invasive plants under some control, it's just going to depend on what the plants that you have are. What do you want to do? How much time and resources do you want to spend on this? And time of year is really important. So most species right now is not a good herbicide application time, but it's a great time to scout and make plans for later.
And where can they go for more information on some invasive plants?
Well, you can go to our website, the University of Kentucky website. There are also some great resources online. So, for example, if you're trying to figure out how do I best control bush honeysuckle or Callery pear or lesser celandine, the U.S. Forest Service actually has a free book that you can find online on how to manage every invasive plant that's out there in the southeast. And it will give you, exactly what you should do for that. What are all of your options and that people have tried and what they recommend. And so you can just Google that and find, invasive plant management of the southeast, and it's a fantastic guide.
Great.
That's good.
Well, thanks for coming in and doing an extension notes for us, Ellen. We greatly appreciate it. If you'd like more information on what you've heard on this segment of today's show, visit our website at www.fromthewoodsky.org. Stay tuned now for Wildlife Sounds from the Forest.
Welcome to Wildlife Sounds from the Forest. This week we have a guest with us to talk about the sound we heard earlier. Today we have Lori Thomas, Extension Forester within the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources, and she's going to tell us all about this sound that you hear now.
Okay, Lori, what was that sound?
That's a good sound, isn't it?
Yes, it
It's
is.
very loud. It's very strong. It is a bird, obviously, as you can tell. It's a
Right.
bird that you all will, this time of year, it's one of our spring migratory birds that we might hear long before we see here in Kentucky, and it is called a Kentucky Warbler. It's one of a group of many of our songbirds that migrate. So these birds are now starting, in the past couple of months, they've started leaving their wintering grounds in Central and South America, making that flight up through here. Some will stay here and nest in Kentucky. Others will go further north to nest and raise their young.
It's a long flight.
It is. It's a very long flight. They'll do that and to raise their young during the summer. And then they'll migrate back in the fall to their wintering grounds in Central and South America. But Kentucky's kind of along that route. We get a lot of these migratory songbirds. We get a lot of times we group them as warblers, or a big group of them. And they're known warblers. They warble. They have great songs.
Right.
And those birds are moving from their wintering grounds in Central and South America up through this area. And as I said, some do stay here and nest, such as the one we just heard, the Kentucky Warbler. It can nest here too. But they're following a food source. Most of these birds predominantly eat insects. They're insectivores. They will also eat nuts and berries and stuff too as needed, but they prefer those energy-rich insects. So that's why we see this migration
why they
pattern.
migrate.
And as it gets colder in the fall, they're going to start migrating south again to where the food source is.
Where the insects are, I don't know, the insects hibernate? I don't know what they're doing, but they're no
Well,
longer out.
Exactly. So what we just heard was the Kentucky Warbler, which it's one of two migratory songbirds we'll talk about today.
Okay.
But it's one that definitely I was going to say on the lookout for, but it's kind of a secretive bird. I mean, may not.
Secretive.
You're going to probably hear it. You heard how loud and
Right.
strong that call was, and it tends to get up high in the tree and make its call. But then for the most part, it spends the rest of the day while it's out looking for food, foraging and whatnot. It's down lower in that canopy, even to being as far as being on the ground.
Oh, okay.
So it's going to be a little more secretive, but if you do see this guy, it's a very pretty bird, and it is called the Kentucky Warbler because it was first described here in the early 1800s. He described that bird here in Kentucky, thus named it the Kentucky Warbler.
Okay.
But it's a moderately sized warbler. It's not the smallest of them. It's about 5 inches long.
Okay.
So warblers tend to be a little bit smaller.
What are their colors?
And he's really nice, he and she. And the male tends to be brighter than the female.
Always.
Yes, right. It has a bright olive green upper part, so that's like down the back, and the under part is bright yellow. So this is striking when you see it out in the woods. And it has a black mask, which is kind of cool, and sideburns. So it's got this kind of yellowish on the head, and then yellow spectacles. They'll be kind of above the eyes, and then you've got the black sideburns, and then the black mask on the rest of the face. So it's really, really a neat, striking bird once you see it. It has pink feet, so that's another
Pink feet.
distinguishing characteristic. And its vocalization or its song, it's loud, as you heard, and it's usually made up of a series of rolling musical notes. Some will say 4 to 8. It's like preet, 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 or you can even hear the churry, 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 with each note being repeated 6 to 8 times. And like you heard it, it's pretty easy to hear. But yeah, it's a very, I wouldn't say it's a very common bird, but you would have an opportunity to see or hear this bird, particularly, I know I've had experience with them at Raven Run and at the Lexington Cemetery. Both
So they are in Lexington.
Yes,
Okay.
both good places to hear and see the Kentucky Warbler as well as others. And a fun fact about the Kentucky Warbler, a group of Kentucky Warblers are collectively known as a derby of warblers.
Derby.
Yeah, no, so it's pretty fun.
And since they're from Kentucky, it's a Kentucky Derby.
Derby, exactly. So that's a great one to be on the lookout for this time of year. And as I said, it may actually, many of them will nest here, but once they are on their nest and raising their young, they're not going to be singing as much. They don't need to attract that mate. So you won't be able to find them that way. And as we said, it's a little bit secretive. All right, so as I said, the Kentucky Warbler, a great one, good time of year, get out, see if you can hear it, and hopefully maybe see it. But now we're going to play another one, and this is another great, kind of a very distinctive call, and we'll let that play for a second.
Okay.
Okay, so that one, as you can, very different.
Very
it has
different.
very buzzy sound,
Right.
nasally. It's ascending notes that zzz, 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 zzz. Very unique when you hear that. Again, another This is a warbler as well, an even smaller warbler. This one's called the Prairie Warbler, which is interesting because it's not generally found in prairies. Very commonly, you go to Raven Run is a great place to find this warbler. You're going to find it on the edge of the woods, in their kind of around their cedar, where there's cedar trees there, and even in some of their older meadows down there. You'll hear this bird, and maybe if you're lucky, you'll see it, but you're definitely going to hear it. It's got a very distinctive sound. But it's, like I said, it's called the Prairie Warbler. Again, a warbler, migratory songbird, just like we talked about with the Kentucky Warbler. It's a little bit smaller, and it's coloring not quite as distinctive, partly due to habitat, but it's got more streaking on it, olive green upper parts, and it's got reddish brown streaking on the back, and it has bright yellow underparts, again like our Kentucky Warbler does, and it has a yellow cap. It's not darker on the head, and he has a bright yellow face with a dark eye and cheek stripes, which are almost black. So if you do get to see it, it's kind of neat. It might be out on a low shrub out in like down at Raven Run, we would see them there out in some of those low shrubs up in the top of that shrub, just singing away, doing the bzz, 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 bzz.
Yeah.
So a very
Does he have pink feet?
No. And you would have a hard time probably noticing it with this one. But again, you find this guy, like I said, old pastures and mixed pine oak barrens, the meadows at Raven Run. So this is another one we could see around here as well. Some of your smaller parks might not see it. It kind of likes a little bit more area, something more in the size of Raven Run, a larger type meadow or old field type situation.
Could it be at Jacobson?
You might, yes, you might. There's enough open area and enough mixture and edge there that you might actually.
That's a pretty big park, so I thought
hear
maybe
it at Jacobson as well. Jacobson Park is another good one to maybe get out this time of year and see if you can hear and maybe see some of these warblers. But I like it because it's got that very distinct buzzing zee sound, so it's pretty easy to pick that one out because there's so many that come through this time of year that you have a hard time remembering it. And for me, both the Kentucky Warbler and the Prairie Warbler were two easy ones to remember, kind of unique and different sounds. So hopefully you can get out this time of year, go to some places like Raven Run Nature Sanctuary, McConnell Springs Park. Lots of warblers there. Maybe not the prairie, but you'll see lots of other warblers. The Lexington Cemetery is a birding hotspot this time of year, as are the Arboretum Woods too. So get out, try to see some, listen for them. If you don't have the Merlin Bird app, you can put that on your phone. That'll help you with the vocalizations some as well. But get out and try to hear and see some of these warblers this time of year. So it's a good time to go out. One thing I did want to mention, speaking of warblers, this is, as we said, this is the spring migratory season. Right? There is a big event, and it's a global event, and it's called the Global Big Day. And it's May 4th of this year, and it's for people to go out and count birds. And it's just what it sounds. It's the Global Big Day. People go out and count birds, and you submit your bird counts through eBird, which the Cornell Lab of Ornithology hosts that site. Very easy to do. You can do it on your phone. Just go check it out through Cornell. It's part of the citizen science. I think we've talked about it before. But again, it's May 4th of this year, and just a few stats from last year. From 2018 on the Global Big Day, which here in Fayette County we participated. We actually competed against Jefferson County. But it's
always a good thing.
Yes, in 2018, there were 79,000 checklists submitted for the one day.
Oh my!
7,000 species were recorded, and there were 30,000 different participants. So it is truly a global big day. It's not just here. This is around the world. So if you want to get out on I think that's Derby Day. Get out and do something else. In addition to Derby, go out and count some birds and be a part of the Global Big Day on May 4th.
Great. Well, thank you for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you for joining us today, and we have a new show schedule for spring 2019. You can listen to us live on WRFL 88.1 FM on Mondays from 11 a.m. to noon. And if you missed the Monday shows, you can listen to our podcasts on our website at www.fromthewoodsky.org.
Hey there. If you're enjoying this podcast from WRFL Lexington, you may enjoy our live radio stream at WRFL.FM and, of course, via radio at 88.1 FM in the Central Kentucky area. We have a wide variety of programs you're sure to enjoy. Just go to WRFL.FM/schedule and see what programs appeal most to you. Thanks again for listening to this podcast from WRFL Lexington.